We are back on the InfoWars Nightly News. We turn now to Lloyd Chapman, head of the American Small Business League at absl.com. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Chapman.
Thank you.
So we've got an election coming up. Obviously, the economy is one of the biggest issues around, and you've stumbled onto the story really no one wants to talk about, although it has been in the mainstream press, and that's the fact that small businesses are being kept from the kind of dollars that they're legally have been required to receive. And obviously, without a promotion of small business, we're never going to see true economic growth. It's just going to stagnate in those big corporate welfare circles that aren't really creating new jobs.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, break down some of the key issues for us on this.
All right. Well, most recently, I've seen on the news, I think it was last Thursday, the Congressional Budget Office came out and said that we're on the verge of another, economic meltdown. People are now starting to admit that Europe is in a depression. And the Census Bureau tells us very simply that small businesses are responsible for over 90% of all net new jobs. Small businesses employ over half of the private sector workforce. They're responsible for half the gross domestic product. 90% of U.S. exporters are small businesses. So it's beyond refute that small businesses are the engine of economic growth in America. Secondly, federal law says a minimum of 23% of all federal contracts should go to small businesses. That makes sense. Small businesses create, the overwhelming majority of all net new jobs. So it's a good idea to reinvest our tax dollars into the companies where most Americans work, where most of the gross domestic product is generated, over 90% of the exports and most of the new jobs. And yet, for over a decade, we've seen over a dozen federal investigations that found that most of the money that by law should go to small businesses is being illegally diverted to the biggest corporations around the world, not just Fortune 500 firms in the U.S., but Rolls-Royce, British Aerospace, Finmeccanica in Italy with, I think, 76,000 employees. And about a month ago, it came out that the U.S. gave, I think, $370 million in small business contracts to an arms dealer owned by the Russian government. And it's just almost impossible to get this story in the mainstream media because of all the pushback from the government.
Well, obviously, these firms getting all the no-bid contracts and the insider information on these contracts are loaded with lobbyists, which small businesses generally cannot afford to provide.
No, plus, the government has hired the biggest public relations firms in the world. We've done research and through the Freedom of Information Act, been able to get the documents that shows that the SBA, for example, hired an international public relations firm that specializes in crisis management. So they spent a lot of time trying to keep the story out of the media. About 3 months ago, I did an interview with CBS. And when the interview was over, there was a cameraman, the producer, and a reporter on the phone. And I told them, I said, this story will never be seen. I said, you can't do a story about this. You can't put Lloyd Chapman on national television talking about how the Obama administration is giving billions of dollars a month in small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms. And they looked at me like I was crazy. Well, the story never ran. About a month ago, we worked with the Washington Post for over a month on this story. We gave them the names of people like Professor Charles Tiefer, who is one of the nation's leading experts on federal contracting law, to talk to, and Peg Gustafson, the Inspector General for the SBA. But they never ran the story. So I've been through this, gosh, probably 100 times over the last 10 years, where I work with a major media outlet on this story. And for a variety of different reasons, the story always gets pulled. And if the story does run, I had a piece run on NBC about 2 months ago here in Northern California. And if you watch it on YouTube, even though there's been a number of reports that say this is fraud, they call it vendor deception, false certification, or proper certifications. If you watch the NBC piece, it closes with 3 levels of disclaimers that there's no fraud. And yet, there's been a number of federal investigations that found fraud. So I've never seen this story done that didn't have the influence of the government, on it. So, my goal is to try to get someone from the mainstream media, to do this story. And someone should ask President Obama this question during the elections. I think it'd be a great question for the presidential debate.
If they took real questions.
Well, I'd like to have someone ask President Obama, why his administration is giving small business contracts to an arms dealer owned by the Russian government, for example. I'd like to see what he says to that.
But of course, we're dealing with a two-party deception, a two-party cover-up. Romney's a big part of this as well.
Yeah, in fact, you know, it doesn't really matter to me who's elected. Whoever it is will still be controlled significantly by Fortune 500 corporations. And it doesn't matter if Romney's elected or Obama's elected. I know that they're going to keep giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms, even if it pushes America into a depression we won't recover from, you know, for 20 years, because those people are the ones that run our government.
And they're prostituted out to them. What's been your reaction to Paul Ryan being picked as VP? He has the public image of someone who could reform the economy, but these are such deep-set issues, and there's so much avoiding of the real problems. I don't see any possibility for serious reform, but I'd like your take.
No, again, it doesn't matter. I've thought this through, gosh, how many administrations, you know, 3 or 4, maybe 4. And it doesn't matter. It's all about, you know, the corporations have so much influence in Washington. When you think about the people in America, if we were to poll the people of America and say, do you think that Fortune 500 firms should get federal small business contracts? I would say 100% of people would say absolutely not. And yet this has gone on every single day for over a decade, and no legislation or policy has ever been adopted to stop it. And it's very troubling. I'll tell you a story. Maybe I've told this story before, but about 2 years ago, I fell asleep on my couch one night watching television. I woke up in the middle of the night, and it was what looked like a BBC, CNN show. And there were 5 economists from around the world, I think with Japan, Russia, France, England, someplace else. And 24 months ago, they said if the U.S. doesn't bring down unemployment, it's going to push the U.S. into another economic, downturn, which will push the world economy over the edge into a worldwide depression. That was two years ago. The only way to cut unemployment is to start giving money to small businesses. You know, small businesses create over 90% of all net new jobs. The Kauffman Foundation came out with a study a couple of years ago, and they said small businesses have created 100% of the net new jobs since 1980. Conversely, that means Fortune 1000 firms haven't created 1 net new job in 30 years. So the only way to actually create jobs is to, try to give more government spending to small businesses. Of course, there's a law in place, designed to do that. But so what's funny to me is I think this issue has a lot to do with why U.S. unemployment is still so low. And it could be, this issue could be a contributing factor to pushing the entire world into a worldwide recession because it's based so much on the U.S. economy.
Right. So, Lloyd, I've got Bloomberg from February 2012 saying it's a $16 billion fraud. This is just over the contracts that were supposed to be awarded to small businesses. A, is that the real scale, or has that grown since, the number of dollars not awarded to small businesses? But separate from government contracts, what other factors in the economy are keeping small businesses from being able to do what they're supposed to be doing?
Well, I say it's about $100 billion a year, not 16. So I've seen individual companies getting as much as $1 billion a year in small business contracts. A few years ago, Titan Industries, a Fortune 500 defense contractor in San Diego, got $500 million. So in my mind, it's closer to $100 billion for a couple of reasons. The law says that small business should get a minimum of 23% of the total value of all federal contracts and subcontracts. The government says that the acquisition budget is around $500 billion. It's closer to $1 trillion. The Pentagon budget is, I think, somewhere over $500 billion. So they're lying to us about how much money they're spending, first of all. Second of all, the Obama administration came out recently and said they awarded, 22.7% to small businesses. But of the top 100 recipients, 72 were large corporations, including, I think, this Russian company. So it's just a complete, sham. In fact, I've had 2 senior SB executives tell me in the last few years that the government's entire small business program is all smoke and mirrors. So solving that problem, which would be real simple, President Obama could do it with a 1-line executive order, which would say the U.S. will no longer report awards to publicly traded companies as small business awards. That would do more to create jobs than anything here President Bush ever did. But again, that's not going to happen because that's not what the Fortune 500 firms that pull the strings in Washington want. You talk about other problems facing small businesses. The government seems to be anti-small business. They talk a lot. You'll see Paul Ryan and Obama and Biden and Mitt Romney talk about small businesses. But when you look at what the government does, the Small Business Administration is the only agency in this country to help small businesses. There's 28 million small businesses. Again, we've talked about they create almost all the net new jobs. That agency has a budget of something like $700 million. That's ridiculous. I think the SBA budget is something like 1% of what the Pentagon budget is. That should be one of the largest agencies in Washington. When you have a country whose economy is based upon small businesses, and you've got one agency to service those small businesses. By the way, the SBA's staff has been gutted in the last 5 or 6 years, probably the last decade. Mm-hmm. But I put out a piece over the weekend that said that doubling the Small Business Administration's budget could help solve the deficit problem. And when you watch the news about the deficit, they talk about cutting spending and raising taxes. What they don't talk about is how can we increase revenue without raising taxes? A real easy way is to start channeling the proper amount of federal contracts to small businesses the law requires. And that would generate lots of revenue and really help cut the deficit. But again, I don't think that's going to happen.
By the way, you talk about 72 of the 100 companies you profiled being too big. What's the best working definition? When does a business stop being a small business and become these giant corporate entities?
I think everybody in America knows what a small business is if you ask them. Again, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, 98% of all U.S. firms have less than 100 employees. And I would say that's a good definition. By the way, 89% of all U.S. firms have less than 20 employees. So if you went to federal court and asked a federal judge to come up with a definition, I think a judge would probably say no more than 50 employees would be a small business. But I'll go ahead and go with up to 100. But quite frankly, a small business in America is a company with probably, I think the average U.S. firm has something like 9 employees. But I think it'd be fair to say that a small business is up to 100 employees. But again, you see, gosh, I can't think of a Fortune 500 firm off the top of my head that has not gotten small business contracts. Microsoft, Dell, Apple, IBM, Sherwin-Williams, Marriott, Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop, Raytheon, but everyone in America knows what a small business is, and it's certainly not Fortune 500 companies.
Sure. Now, you talk about the contempt from the government against small businesses. I don't know if we've had a greater remark in the rhetoric side of things than Obama, a month and a half ago, saying you didn't build that, his big gaffe, his unscripted moment where he kind of let out this contempt for people who've built their own businesses, tried to pave their own way, and is really heralding the age of big and bigger government.
Absolutely. I endorsed President Obama for president, and he put my endorsement on the front page of his website. We worked with his campaign. And in February of 2008, he came out with a statement that said it's time to end the diversion of federal small business contracts to corporate giants. Not only has he not done that, but a couple of years ago, his administration removed a field on the government's database of contractors, which was called the parent company Dun & Bradstreet number. And that's how federal investigators and people like me and journalists would use to see who really owns a company.
Makes it easy to hide a shell company.
So President Obama's administration made it easier for people to commit felony contracting fraud, made it harder for federal investigators and journalists to show that they're diverting small business contracts to large businesses. In fact, about a month ago, the Small Business Administration proposed a policy to give federal small business contracts to foreign-owned companies.
Now, when Fortune 500 becomes the biggest donors to the Romney campaign, to the Obama campaign, there's all this insider knowledge, no bid contracts. Obviously, this is not just money issues, but it's affecting policy as well. Absolutely.
In fact, I wrote a bill called the Fairness and Transparency in Contracting Act about 6 years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And that's a bill that I think 100% of American people would support. It's just going to stop the government from giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms. And that bill will never be passed, I don't think. It doesn't have a snowball's chance of passing because the Fortune 500 firms that receive so much of this money, they control the congressional committees like the House and Senate Small Business Committee that you would have to get that bill through. But it's really disturbing, but it's having a dramatic negative impact on this nation's economy. And I would have to say that I would call the government anti-small business. I would call the United States government anti-small business. In fact, here's something I'll say that'll make a lot of people mad. If anyone watching this can think of a group that you think represents small businesses, call them up and ask them why they've never come out opposing the cut in the Small Business Administration budget, and ask them why they've never said a word about the diversion of billions of dollars a month in federal small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms. So if you really look at who backs groups out there that hold themselves out as being small business organizations, I've never seen one that wasn't backed by Fortune 500 firms. So every group out there in America that holds themselves out as a national group to support small businesses is in truth funded primarily by money from Fortune 500 firms. So I don't think there is a legitimate small business group in America, quite frankly, other than the American Small Business League. Anyone that's mad about that, show me what you've done to stop them from giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms. To put that in perspective, by the way, I think that's the single biggest issue that affects small businesses because it's the most money. And we're talking about probably $100 billion a year that small businesses should be getting. They're being diverted, to large corporations. But any group that claims to represent small businesses, if they were legitimate, would have gotten on board with this issue. But I don't think you'll find any national group that's done that.
The Republican convention's kicking off this week. We know what kind of circus and farce this staged election is about to be. We know the issues the corporate media are going to refuse to touch. But what is the short, simple message you would send out to the people about the incredible importance of small business to reviving the economy? How can we get this into people's heads to the extent that the alternative media now carries the message in a competing fashion with the controlled corporate media?
Well, I think, when I'm trying to be persuasive, I try to just stick to the facts. So the U.S. Census Bureau, if you look on their website today, they say that small businesses create over 90% of all net new jobs. Now, compare that with where the stimulus money has gone. Probably 95% of stimulus money has gone to Fortune 1000 firms that haven't created hardly any net new jobs in the last decade. So people need to realize this is a small business nation based upon a small business economy. And you will not see that mentioned on national television. You can sit there and watch national television all day long, and you'll never see Wolf Blitzer or anybody else from the mainstream media mention that fact. And until people start to realize America is based upon a small business economy, our economy is going to continue to struggle. And people need to get mad about this. People should be outraged about this. There's a lot of things people are mad about. But to me, this is something that people should really be outraged about, is how the government, how poorly they treat small businesses.
Lloyd, remind people where they can find your work, what your website is, and what issues you're going to be focusing on the most as this election comes up, as we try to speak some sense into a system that isn't prepared to listen.
Our website is asbl.com. You can go to YouTube and search on Lloyd Chapman and see all my appearances on your show and a lot of other shows. And I think my main focus until the election is to try to get someone from the mainstream media to cover this story and have someone ask President Obama one question, which is, why is your administration giving federal small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms and an arms dealer owned by the Russian government? I'd love to see President Obama answer that question on national television. I'd love to see people ask Mitt Romney, if you're elected president, will you end the Obama administration policy of giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms? I'd love to see what Mitt Romney would say to that.
There you have it. Lloyd Chapman, thanks for joining us, and we'll speak to you again in the future.
All right.
That's it for the InfoWars Nightly News tonight, but it's a no-brainer. Controlled economies are destructive and despotic, and people die from them. Small businesses are the spark that made America great. You just heard Lloyd Chapman on it. Do your own research. It's true throughout history. We'll be back again tomorrow. Thanks for watching the InfoWars Nightly News. Don't forget about prisonplanet.tv, where you can support us financially, but also get the information, the tools, the videos to spread to other people to help wake them up. That's what we need more than ever. And of course, planetinfowars.com, it's growing. People are posting contents. They're fighting the info war their way. They're reaching people in their niches, in their parts of the world, and in their common interest pools. And that's how we're going to win this war, all together, doing our own part for liberty, for truth, in a decentralized manner, globally, people, globally. Thanks for watching. Good night.